Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Agnieszka Otwinowska-Kasztelanic, and on behalf of the University of Warsaw Excellence Initiative, I have the pleasure to chair the series of 6 lectures entitled Current Trends in Multilingualism Research. Our today's guest is Jasone Cenoz, who is Professor of Research Methods in Education at the University of the Basque Country. Her research focuses on psycholinguistic, sociolinguistics, and educational aspects of bilingualism and multilingualism. Jasone Cenoz is President of Educational Science Committee of the Spanish Research Council and Chair of the Book Award Committee of the American Association of Applied Linguistics. She has also been a member of the Executive Committee of ILA, the International Association of Applied Linguistics. In 2003, she co-founded the International Association of Multilingualism, was a member of its executive committee, and was then president of the association. Jasone Cenoz has published extensively and has presented her work at conferences and seminars in both European countries, the USA, Canada, Australia, China, India, Singapore, and New Zealand. Her publications include several books and over 100 papers and chapters. Her research interests include the effect of bilingualism on third language acquisition, pragmatic and phonetic competence, the age factor in language acquisition, bilingual and multilingual education, minority languages, the linguistic landscape, and research methods in bilingualism and multilingualism. Professor Cenoz has co-founded the International Journal of Multilingualism, where she acted as editor until 2012. She is on the editorial board of several scientific journals, including the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics, European Journal of Applied Linguistics, the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, and Language, Culture, and Curriculum. She is now taking part in several international projects aiming to study multilingual competence in education, as well as language acquisition and academic performance of immigrant students. Jasone, it's over to you. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the University of Warsaw.
Thank you very much. I'm really very happy to be able to share my work with you, and I would like to thank Agnieszka very much and the University of Warsaw for the kind invitation to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen now, and we are going to see that I'm going to talk about focus on multilingualism and translanguaging in education. And first, just a second, because I couldn't turn. Okay. First, I'm going to talk about the approach focused on multilingualism. Then I'm going to talk a bit about translanguaging. Well, most of the talk is in fact going to be about translanguaging, pedagogical translanguaging, and translanguaging and minority languages. And then some final remarks. Okay, so let's look at focus on multilingualism. When we look at this picture here, we see that 3 languages are together, the L1, the L2, and the L3, and that they share some aspects. So the idea of focus on multilingualism that I have worked with Dirk Orter is it looks at the relationships between the languages when conducting research, teaching, or assessing different languages. So the idea is to look at the relationships between languages and not to look just at the languages in isolation. When we are looking at multilingualism, we have a focus that is multilingual. So we are going into softening the boundaries between languages, from hard boundaries to soft boundaries. What are hard boundaries? When we look at the school, when we think about hard boundaries, is when there is no code mixing, shouldn't be any code mixing, code switching. If possible, it's the idea that one teacher teaches one language, and if possible, in some cases, the teacher pretends not to speak other languages. No translation, and independent syllabuses, so that if there is, for example, English is taught or another language, there is no coordination between the teachers. When we're going to focus on multilingualism, we look at this differently. And we look at the speaker, the student, as multilingual. Multilingual, even if it is emergent multilingual, but still multilingual. And the repertoire is the repertoire of the different languages, of all the languages that the child or the student is can speak or is learning. And all that is in a social context. So if we compare the views, the traditional views that are more monolingual views compared to multilingual views, we have the idea in monolingual views like languages almost contaminate each other. So while we think that in most cases, it's possible for languages to reinforce each other. On the other hand, if we think of monolingual views, the aim is balanced multilingualism for all situations. It's the idea that if you are not a perfect speaker of each language, it's not okay. While we know that multilinguals use their languages for different purposes and they can have different skills, and they cannot be compared to monolinguals because they are different. And the same when we look at another aspect of monolingual views could be to look at non-existing monolingual societies as a reference. We know that nowadays, more than ever, there are no monolingual societies. And what we have to think is about real multilingual societies as a reference. So we work with this view of looking at what languages have in common at school and when we do research, and to have a multilingual lens when we are working with languages or doing research or teaching them. Okay, but the famous term is, of course, translanguaging. Translanguaging is a term that has gained currency in the last years, and it really refers to different. It's understood in different ways. So let's see two main dimensions of translanguaging. On the one hand, there is pedagogical translanguaging, when we are talking about instructional strategies that integrate two or more languages. It's a pedagogic theory and practice. Here we are talking about planning and using some strategies to teach. This is what we are talking about. But there is also translanguaging is also used as a spontaneous translanguaging, the reality of bilingual usage in naturally occurring contexts where boundaries between languages are fluid and constantly shifting. I mean, this, if I'm talking in my context, which I use different languages every day, but let's say most people in my context use Basque and Spanish, and sometimes they are kind of going naturally between one and the other language, and they may use some words, they may change, and they can be a turn in one language, a turn in another language. So the boundaries between the two languages are soft. So we understand these two types of translanguaging, but we see them as a continuum, not just as a complete dichotomy, because we can have the two ends of the continuum can be pedagogical or spontaneous. But if we think about a class, for example, and we think about a strategy that has been planned as pedagogical to use resources from all the languages in the multilingual repertoire students have, they could also be, as part of that, there could be some spontaneous translanguaging, because the students may use some spontaneous translanguaging also in class, not only pedagogical translanguaging. And at the same time, that spontaneous translanguaging can be used in a pedagogical way by the teacher. So it's not that they are completely separate, completely different. But of course, there is it can go, I mean, the practices can go into being just spontaneous, or they have been planned by the teacher in the class with a pedagogical aim. Right, let's look at the origin of translanguaging. The origin of translanguaging is clearly pedagogical. is completely towards the pedagogical end of the continuum. So it comes from Welsh bilingual education, and it was Ken Williams who considered this translanguaging a pedagogical practice which deliberately switches the language mode of the input and output in bilingual classrooms in Wales. The idea is that this was two languages were used in the same class, and one for the input and one for the output. That could be, for example, and here's an example from Williams from his thesis in 1994, even though translanguaging has become more used and used a lot more much later. But this is, for example, a text of about the Industrial Revolution. There are, and you see A, you don't have to read the text, but you see A is a picture, B is a text in English, C is a picture, D is again a text in English, and E is in Welsh. And then, so here is not only input in one language and output in the other, it can also be input in two languages, because this is English and Welsh. But there is the idea, in this case, the question was in English, but it could have been also in Welsh. That is, imagine that you lived in an industrial town during the 19th century, write a diary entry for the 15th July, 1845. Remember to include information about the house, street, and town. That information is in Welsh. So you need Welsh and you need English to do this exercise. And you are using the same content, but content about about the Industrial Revolution in this case, in Wales and in England, but it is, you are using this content, but you are using two languages for the same content. The idea is, according to Louis Baker, Jones and Baker, is that translanguaging requires a deeper understanding than just translating, as it moves from finding parallel words to processing and relying meaning and understanding. So it goes deeper than just finding the words. It's processing the whole meaning in more than one language. So what is important, and because this is also linked to this distinction between pedagogical and spontaneous translanguaging, what is important is to see that the way translanguaging in its original way was used in Wales, which is first, identify successful and planned bilingual pedagogical practices at school. So by observing schools, Ken Williams identified this practice, this type of practice, and he saw that it could work very well in the classroom. Then define their characteristics and label them as translanguaging, so to see what translanguaging was, and then propose their extension to other bilingual classes at school. So this is the way it was originally used, but there have been important changes with translanguaging, and mainly when it has gone, as Louis Jones and Baker say, it has gone from the school to the street. And this is translanguaging in the US, how it is used. One thing that is very important is to take into consideration that the situation in the US regarding aspects such as, I mean, that we also share some of those, of course, in Europe, but the situation with, for example, Hispanic students in the US and immigrant students or Latino students in the US. So the idea is linked in the US to a more, it is also pedagogical, of course, but it is also very closely linked to social concerns about the use of languages at school. So Ofelia Garcia has worked very hard with the concept of translanguaging in a very successful way. And we can see that the way it goes is somehow from the street to the school, not from the school it has gone from the school is the origin, it has gone, let's say, to the street, and now it goes back to school, because what the idea is to observe natural and planned bilingual communicative practices in different contexts, then to define these characteristics and call them translanguaging, which is a different way of, it's a different reality, we can say, even if it's linked about the use of at least 2 languages. But it's different from the idea of translanguaging being pedagogical and planned in Wales. But the idea is to propose the legitimization by accepting them at school. So it's the idea of accepting these practices at school, these practices that are produced spontaneously and use elements from, we can say, for example, from Spanish and English in the States, okay? And this is related in many ways with a whole theory about not only soft boundaries between languages, as I said before, but more like languages don't exist, they only exist as social constructs, and only practices exist. And we only have a repertoire with elements that are associated with the so-called languages, okay? But that's, there are different positions about that. But let me focus now on what we work at University of the Basque Country, what we work with pedagogical translanguaging and the way we define it. We call pedagogical translanguaging planned. I mean, this is closer, we can say, to the origin of translanguaging in Wales, and planned by the teacher inside the classroom, and can refer to the use of different languages for input and output, which is the most typical way in the origin of translanguaging, but also to other planned strategies based on the use of a student's resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. So the idea is it is planned inside in the classroom. It uses different languages. It can be input and output, but it can also be that as far as they have a pedagogical purpose and they are using resources in different ways, but resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. So the idea is that the core characteristics, we could say, of pedagogical translanguaging, the type of program will be multilingual education, or second additional language education, additional including foreign language education. Students will be multilingual to a certain extent, at least emergent multilinguals. The aim of the school is linguistic and academic development in several languages. And the organization of the pedagogical translanguaging is that it is planned and it is designed. And the approach, we can say, is a multilingual approach, a heteroglossic approach. So one of the key elements in pedagogical translanguaging is metalinguistic awareness, because it's the idea of becoming aware of the whole linguistic repertoire, of the multilingual repertoire students have. And this can be, I mean, we're talking about the repertoire can be done at different levels, phonetics or lexicon, morphosyntax, pragmatics, discourse, or it can be done as reading, writing, listening, speaking, interaction, different skills also. So it is linked to the original Welsh concept of translanguaging, but including a wide range of pedagogical practices. So let's look a bit at some of this, how we do it, or which pedagogical practices. But before we do that, let's look at some resources. I mean, it's not always called pedagogical translanguaging, but we can see that there are ways to work, for example, with cognates, and we have some resources there across languages working with cognates, also morphological awareness, writing, translating, bilingual readers. There are many possibilities. But let's look at some examples. For example, if we are teaching science in English, as it can be a CLIL program, and we have a text about digestion. What we do is to work, in this case, is working on vocabulary, and to work on the relationship between the words in the text and the cognates that can be in other languages. In this case, you have English, Basque, and Spanish. We can be working with this, working with the resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. But this is only one of the possibilities, but we work in the same unit. They can be many other resources. Another possibility is to work, for example, with compounds. And here we have, for example, Basque, Spanish, and English. These are the languages we work with. And we can have a word like liburu denda in Basque, which is liburu plus denda, which is exactly the same structure as when it is in English bookshop, book and shop, because even if Basque is a non-European language and related to others and all this, in some cases, you can have some cases in which the structures are similar, while in Spanish, it is not similar. It is librería, right? And it's also, by the way, a false friend at the same time, because librería is bookshop and not library. But what we can do is to look, for example, combining, in this case, we work with a linguistic landscape. Students can bring pictures. Some can be found also on internet. And then they can work with shops, for example, and what they do. And here they have which ones are related in one language or in another. But it can be, I mean, these two examples are from vocabulary, but let's look, for example, at discourse. We can see when telling a story, if you have some formulas, how to start at the beginning, at the end, and you have in English, once upon a time, or they lived happily ever after, what we have is also how do you say this in the other two languages that they study in the curriculum. Or another example could be when the structure, what you have as the structure of writing in the three languages. So what we see is that in many cases, what we find is that even if there are three different languages, the basic organization of a text can be the same in the three languages. And sometimes what the students are getting is they are getting the organization of a text in one language, then perhaps 2 months later, they have to write a similar type of text in another language, and then they are given kind of perhaps even different instructions, and then later in a third language. And this doesn't work. It's much better if we give them the opportunity for languages to reinforce each other. And this can be done at the vocabulary level or at the discourse level or at any other levels. I mean, it can be at the pragmatic level. There can be many phonetic, many ways. We have done some research after the implementation of several units in a school and having a control group and also an experimental and control group. And we have seen, and here in red, we have the experimental group, we have seen with tests of morpheme identification and word derivation, we see that the results are slightly better, but we are still working on this and working on, there is still a lot to be done, of course, which areas of, which are working better in pedagogical translanguaging, which ones are better than others, and which ages are more receptive to give them the tools to benefit from the whole linguistic repertoire. That's the idea. We also got feedback from students. I'm going to show you a bit. For example, here, this is it's written in Basque, but you have the translation in white. It says, "Errazagoa izan da hiru hizkuntzekin egitea lan. It has been easier to work with the three languages together. Really? The concepts are better assimilated this way. And why are the concepts better assimilated this way? Because you have them better in the other languages. I mean, what we found with this, with the students, was they were saying that sometimes they were surprised that the three languages have some aspects in common, but we also found that some students who were sometimes shy in class because they didn't know, for example, much English, if they could link prior knowledge of the other languages they have, like Basque and Spanish, with something in English, because they know the other languages, even if they are not that strong in English, they could feel much better also. They could be more interested, more motivated, because they could contribute to that class. And that we have seen not only in the case of this implementation, but also when we organized courses for teachers, and they had to implement, as part of the course, they had to implement some sessions of pedagogical translanguaging. And they also reported the same thing, that students could link knowledge of the knowledge they had to new knowledge, and that they also felt that they were somehow more interested in what they were doing, because they could contribute more. We also asked them in a questionnaire about the experimental group, the ones who had done the translanguaging implementation, and a bit, well, the perceptions of translanguaging. And what you see here is that the low ones are when it says it is confusing, that's number 2. And also, I prefer to learn languages separately, number 6. All the others are positive in a scale that goes to 10. So we also got some feedback, more feedback from the teachers. And this is the idea of these 2 ideas. One, to think of what they previously know about a topic, because their input is always positive, not only for themselves, but for the whole class. This is what a teacher said. And also another teacher was talking about students are given the opportunity to provide the information they have to give to their classmates and teacher, and it increases their self-esteem. They consider themselves important, according to this teacher. Okay, but there is another thing that in some areas, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world, is a bit worrying, and it's the idea of translanguaging and minority languages. I mean, the basic idea here is that if we allow for translanguaging, what is going to happen with languages that are quite weak, we can say, that if everybody is going to use, I mean, the idea, this is very strong in our context, and if everybody is going to be translanguaging, then Basque will disappear, which is a minority language. But this can happen also. I mean, there is also this worry in Wales. There is this worry in many other places. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how we see this. Well, this is just to see where I'm going to refer a little bit to the Basque Country. That's where I am and where I live. And it is part of the Basque countries in France, another part in Spain. It's not an independent country, so it's in between the 2 countries. And there is a language that is Basque, and it is a language that is not related, we could say, to French or to Spanish. It's not a Romance language. It has arrived there, related, we can say, well, nowadays, of course, after many centuries of contact with French and Spanish, and there is also a big influence of these languages on Basque. But the number of speakers of Basque is growing. And this is a sociolinguistic survey for people over the age of 16. And it has gone up in the Basque autonomous community, one part of the Basque country where the measures for protection of the language are stronger. It has gone up from 1991 to 2016 from 24% to 33.9%. So it has gone up, and this is mainly because of school, because of education, and because Basque has become the main language of instruction. If it was including people under 16, it could be even higher. But this, of course, has been an enormous effort and on part of resources and interest, human resources, economic resources, and so on. And the data are very good, of course, in terms of speakers, but many of these speakers, nowadays, many Spanish-speaking parents take their children to Basque medium classes, and it is optional. And they take them to Basque medium education. Basque medium can be 50% Basque, 50% Spanish, or it can be, let's say, almost 100% Basque. And of course, there is also English and there is also CLIL. So it's quite an interesting place for those of us who work on multilingualism. But what is happening is that also because there are many students who are dominant in Spanish, and even if they have Basque as the medium of instruction. And what is happening is that they don't use so much Basque, and that's why there is a worry. So for example, in the case of primary school, and among those who have Basque as the language of instruction, we see that in primary school, most children, 51%, and 28, let's see, the ones in green, they speak Basque or more Basque than Spanish in the classroom. This is not so much in secondary school. It goes more, it's more balanced among the languages, okay? So it is even inside the classroom among themselves or with the teacher. But when it comes to the schoolyard and the breaks, we see that they speak more Spanish than, or well, in primary kind of more balanced, and in secondary more Spanish. This is the reason why looking at this type of situation in Basque schools, Basque medium schools, is the idea that translanguaging can be risky. Because then it will be, I mean, if you allow mainly for spontaneous translanguaging. So for example, we have a teacher saying, we have to reinforce Basque more from the beginning. Do you need to do the same with the Spanish? I say, no. And English? No. We need to reinforce Basque mainly. So what is important to see in this case, and what I would like to highlight here, is that there are differences, the importance of context. I mean, if we think about, for example, about New York, and the schools where, for example, Ofelia Garcia works with, those schools, what the legitimization of translanguaging means to take the practices of the minority to the spaces where only English is used. So it's kind of a recognition of the minority. It's a very important step socially to say this is legitimized, these translanguaging practices, okay? But in the case of situations like it could be in the Basque Country with Basque, it would be taking translanguaging, if you allow for any type of spontaneous translanguaging at school, will be taking the majority language to spaces where the minority language is used. So it is the opposite direction. It goes from the majority to the minority. So talking about this and reflecting a lot about this, Durgotter and I have been thinking about some guiding principles for what we call sustainable translanguaging. Sustainable translanguaging that is compatible with the protection and promotion of minority languages. And here what we have is the idea of the designing breathing spaces for using the minority language I will go back to this in a minute. Then creating situations in which the minority language is needed, and using, so situations in which you really need a minority language, that no translation is provided, that you need it. And then the idea of metalinguistic awareness, that this is done through pedagogical translanguaging, as we have seen with the vocabulary, we have seen with the writing and so on. Then use learners' experiences to develop language awareness and multilingual identities. Their experiences about the languages, about languages of other students. They could be students who speak other home languages, and to talk about what it means, and to discuss and to have some projects about what it means to be speakers of our minority language, and to link spontaneous translanguaging to pedagogical activities. You have an article on this in the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, which is open access in 2017 with a development of this. I just want to say here a little bit about this idea of breathing spaces. That comes, the term comes from Fishman, Joshua Fishman, from 1991, and it is the idea that, and Jim Cummins says that for immersion, that traditionally there is also a lot of debate about immersion in Canada, and there is a lot of debate about translanguaging also there. And Cummins says it is certainly important within immersion programs to create largely separated spaces for each language. Immersion, if we think about French in Canada, in areas where French is not spoken by the students at home and is not spoken so much in their social context. And then that you need some space for that language. And that's what we also think is needed for Basque, that you need spaces where it's only Basque, even if you are supporting that there should be more interaction between languages, that you should use languages to, I mean, the similarities, that you should use pedagogical translanguaging, but still there should be some spaces. Also in the context of Wales, Lewis, Baker, Jones and Baker say the promotion of flexible language arrangements such as translanguaging could easily encourage pupils to focus more on the majority languages. That's always a risk. So it is important, says Ophelia Garcia also says, it is important to preserve a space, although not a rigid and static place, in which the minority language does not compete with the majority language. So yes, translanguaging, yes, but we also have to make it compatible with the promotion and the use of minority languages. That's why we talk about sustainable translanguaging. So I'm going into some final remarks. And one is teaching implications. I mean, the idea of focusing on multilingualism and not only on the target language. This is very important. Also in the case of immigrant students, I mean, they may, if we value that they also speak other languages and not only the target language, or they may have some problems with the target language, but that they can contribute because they have some knowledge of other languages. That is important. Also, to develop pedagogies that consider the speaker as multilingual, the multilingual repertoire and social context. I mean, that the speaker is multilingual and uses the repertoire in a social context, and to provide enough space for the minority language or languages. Okay. There are also some implications for research in all this. One that is very important is that multilingual speakers are not the sum of several monolingual speakers. We cannot expect multilingual speakers, and it's not desirable. It's not that we cannot, they cannot be just as if there were several people, okay? One person can speak several languages, and that can be, it doesn't have to be just adding monolingual competencies. It's a different type of competence, as also, for example, Vivian Cook has explained, and Francois Grosjean already quite a long time ago, they discussed this and they proposed this difference. Another thing that is important from the point of view of research is that studying complex trajectories can shed light on many processes. It's not that, I mean, there are different ways to look at things. I mean, you can look and you can work on analyzing a very specific aspect of one language. That's okay, you can do that. The same as if you are doing research on the human body, you can look at all your life, if you want, at the articulation of the knee and a specific part of that. You can do that, that's possible. But it is also important to know that if we have a more holistic view, we can also discover other things, even about the knee, or even about the specific aspect of language that we are looking at, because we can have another view. So if we look at complex trajectories as several languages at the same time, we can find information that we don't have if we only look at one language at a time. That's quite important. And of course, the idea is to focus on multilingualism, to look at the multilingual speaker using the repertoire in the social context. Regarding minority languages, the idea is to soften boundaries, but it has to be done in a sustainable way, and sustainable translanguaging is rooted in the reality of minority languages, allowing for breathing spaces that create the need to use these languages, and the implementation needs to be tailor-made for a specific context, and taking into account that languages in the wider social context. So the implementation has to be, here we see it better, implementation needs to be tailor-made for a specific context, and it has to take into account the languages used in the wider context and the aims regarding multilingual competence. So what I mean here is that we cannot just say, okay, this is translanguaging, we just bring it here to this school, to this classroom, to this area, to this country. And no, it depends a lot on the social context and the aims regarding the aims we have for different languages. And it has to be tailor-made. We have to look at that. We have to apply that we have to apply it to the context. We can have the ideas, we can have some materials, but we have to apply that to the context. So here we have some references. Before I finish, I just wanted to tell you that if you would like to see a bit of how we work with pedagogical translanguaging in a school in the Basque Country, in YouTube. I'm not going to run it now because we're already in YouTube, but you can see this Let's Make the Most of Multilingualism. It's a short 5-minute video where you can see the children doing the activities. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jasone. I must tell you that I have always been using this film in my classes on multilingualism, and when it comes to our lessons on education, I always use this film to show how you are working with children in the Basque Country. And I must also say that I was quite impressed, because I don't know if you remember, I was present when you launched this film.
Oh yeah.
It was really moving that you not only invited teachers to kind of summarize the project, but also the children, which was very, very, very important for me to see. Okay, we have, I will also have several questions to you, but I can see that there is a request from one of the students whether they could have where they could see the slides with references. Well, I believe that you can rewind the transmission, and then you will be able to do that, right?
They can just about this, if they write to me, to my email, You will find it online easily. Jasone Cenoz, and then is after the and then EHU, EUS. But you can find it easily on the web, and I can send you the references, the list, if you want to see it. Perhaps it's easier to send just those 2 slides or the list of references. No problem. You just ask me for that.
Well, in between, because I can see no other questions right now, I would like to ask you about the motivations of parents who actually bring their children to the Basque medium schools, because you said sometimes these are Spanish-speaking parents. So do you think that they want to kind of emphasize their Basque nationality in this way? Because I of what I know, in the Basque country, it was forbidden to speak Basque for a long time, right?
Of course, there are different motivations. It's not a single motivation. But what has happened is that up to, 1975, we can say we had a dictatorship in Spain, and Basque was not allowed in the public space. It was used at home by some parents, but of course, Basque was in those years, and this dictatorship was quite long. There was a civil war in Spain, 1936 to 1939, and we're talking from 39 to 75. And so Basque was, some people were ashamed of Basque, of speaking Basque, others didn't use it. There were still, in the 60s, some schools in a kind of, at the beginning quite illegally, but then later they had to be more or less accepted a bit. There were Basque, for Basques, L1 students. And then in the 1980s, and there were different laws, and then there was this, the possibility of learning through the medium of Basque was recognized completely, legally. And what has happened is, for some people, it has been like, even if the parents speak Spanish, perhaps the grandparents spoke Basque, and they were not allowed, they didn't have the opportunity, the parents didn't have the opportunity to learn Basque at school, or to practice, or at home even. So they would like the children they want the children to learn Basque. In other cases, what happens also, I think it is that in many cases, there has been more, the teachers have been very motivated to do well, these children do well. And the results have been good also. And on the other hand, this can be more identity, learning the 2 languages instead of learning only one, better results for that. But there are also some practical reasons with them. I mean, you can imagine that nowadays we have almost, in primary school, for example, is like 90% of the schools are Basque medium, or at least 50% Basque medium. Can you imagine, if you want a job as a teacher in the Basque country, you need Basque. I mean, only like 10% of the students, less than that, learn through Spanish. And that happens the same in secondary. It goes in the same direction. It's a little bit lower, but it goes in the same direction. So if you speak both languages, of course, you can have more possibilities, not only in education. Nowadays, I mean, it has been more in public institutions also, because there has been, of course, Basque speakers have the right to go to the town hall or somewhere and speak Basque. So the person working there needs to be bilingual Basque-Spanish, so that one person speaks Basque, the next can speak Spanish. I mean, that's you need that. So there are a lot more jobs in the public sector, but nowadays it's also in the private sector.
Sure.
Quite a lot in the public sector. I mean, in sales, banks, whatever, you can speak Basque in many, everywhere. So there are good reasons, of course, different types of reasons for parents to prefer Basque, because it is optional. But of course, when you have very little of the Spanish medium, it is there is always the possibility, but perhaps there is not a full class in one village and you have to go to the next village and things like that also. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have some questions on the chat. So I will read the first question from Nicole Marks. She says the following: I was wondering if you see multilingualism pedagogy and translanguaging pedagogy as synonymous. The goals and teaching methods seem the same for both terms. Is there the difference more than the first is used in foreign language teaching and the second in the context of heritage and minority languages? So multilingualism versus translanguaging pedagogy, right? Foreign language teaching versus minority language teaching.
Yeah, well, we combine in our context foreign and minority. The difference, I mean, what I find, there are many times there are many labels to call things that are similar, or the same label, as we said with translanguaging, to call things that are different also. That also happens. So what we find, there could be, depending on what is understood by multilingual pedagogies, it can be that it is very similar or is the same in some contexts as pedagogical translanguaging. We use the term, I have nothing against the use of the term multilingual pedagogies, and I think it can be used both for minority languages. I don't see the distinction there between minority languages and foreign languages. But what I see, I mean, with translanguaging, it comes, I mean, it is the idea of the original way to refer to translanguaging was this of Wales, where it is more a pedagogical, it has a pedagogical, specific pedagogical purpose. And we are coming from, I mean, taking that as a basis, the original use of translanguaging.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there are two more questions from Michał Paradowski, and well, I will start from the second one because it is also terminological, kind of referring back to Nicole Marks, and he's asking whether we could also add plurilingual pedagogies to the basket, right? So,
sure, plurilingual. I mean, multilingual, plurilingual. That's also, I mean. There are definitions of plurilingual that different definitions. I mean, some years ago, there was mainly the definition that plurilingual is about the individual and multilingual is about society. It has always, it has happened that plurilingual has had more closely related to a more French origin. It's also very common in Spanish because it sounds quite good in Spanish to say plurilingue instead of multilingual, but in English, it's a lot more common to say multilingual than plurilingual. It depends on that. And nowadays you find also definitions of plurilingual that when you have this, let's say, this multilingual view that about language teaching, this multilingual view, whatever you can, I mean, we work with focus on multilinguals, but it's the multilingual view. When you look at this at language teaching or at research from a multilingual lens, that for some authors, that's plurilingual. And when you don't, it's multilingual. Well, that's a way to, there are ways. I mean, yeah, I mean, it is the way that it is used by some people. Some years ago, it was just that when it is the individual, it's plurilingual. When it is society, it's multilingual. I don't see, I mean, I don't see that. I mean, I use both terms, and in Spanish, I use more plurilingual more times for exactly the same as multilingual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's another question from Michał Paradowski, and it's terminological. Does pedagogical translanguaging need to be planned ahead of time? Or would translanguaging by the instructor in response to a current need also classify as planned, provided that the goal remains pedagogical?
Yeah, there is we are working on different types of this, and there is a distinction. I mean, you can go in different ways. Something that is kind of spontaneous in a way, can become there, that the teacher uses the opportunity, that is also pedagogical translanguaging. I mean, that there is something that is coming and somehow the teacher has not planned that the day before as part of the lesson plan, but there is a possibility of using some resources pedagogically at that moment, because there is, I don't know, there can be an example that a student gives, and then from there, the teacher goes on explaining something pedagogically. That's one possibility. Another thing is to be planned. And the planning can be also at different levels, because what's important, I mean, you can say, well, how can I have, it depends, it can be more or less intense. One thing could be, for example, I teach mainly in English in my class, except for a few, can be some, when we are making some comparisons, I'm doing everything in English, but then I'm coordinated with the teacher of another language. That could be Polish, or it could be Spanish, or it could be whatever language. And so that when we go into something like, for example, in writing or whatever, we are coordinated and we are reinforcing each other. That is one possibility. It could be stronger if you are using more the different languages inside the same session more intensively. So there can be different ways with that. You can do it in different ways.
Okay, we have another question exactly about that from Elvira Munoz, who is asking, what about the implementation of translanguaging in a second or foreign language class with students that have different first languages? How could it be useful, and what are the implications of this in your opinion?
Yeah, you can do, we have been working on this also. I mean, one of the things with students who have different languages is, for example, if they are working on cognates, what we do is also to add a column that says in other languages. So for example, you see, and that is important because then those languages can be valued as well. You could see, how is this, or how, or if you are working at the pragmatic level and you have some functions or whatever, and you say, and how do you do it in the other, and then somebody can say, well, in my home language, which is whatever, is done like this and this. Or, I mean, they can link, it's very important that they can link the prior knowledge. They can be proud somehow that they know that in a different language, and that is contributing, and that's part of the exercise in class. We know it's very difficult to have all the languages in the curriculum, but if we have some, not only respect, but that everybody learns from those languages. This is the idea of the language awareness, but also that the way it is said in another home language is useful for the English class or the other class, whatever class it is. That could be also very useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have people writing many thanks to you in the different languages, including Basque and Spanish and English, right? Thanks for your answers. But we have another question from Fatima Al-Shamiri, and she is asking the following question. How can we use focus on multilingualism approach to improve pupils' writing when it comes to written corrective feedback as an instructional tool?
Yeah, in corrective, I think that it is in when providing feedback as an instruction, it can be, I mean, the important thing is that the students reflect about what they are writing in any language. I mean, it's not only, I mean, one of the things that is needed at the school is to develop a lot reading and writing skills. I mean, and so the important thing when providing feedback is that to give hints so that they reflect about how, for example, why some vocabulary is like that, or some expressions, or even to reflect about aspects that could be in writing. It could be like, what is the intention of the author, or what can be done. I mean, it can be done sometimes more across with resources from other languages, more or less resources, but in the feedback, it is mainly raising metalinguistic awareness, I would say, in terms of pedagogical translanguaging. Other things are needed also. One thing that is important, I think, is not only pedagogical translanguaging. I mean, if you want to, I mean, it's not that everything has to be translanguaging or everything. I mean, it depends on the context. You need some spaces for only one language. And of course, in writing, we can say, okay, pedagogical translanguaging can help, yes. But it doesn't mean that you only need pedagogical translanguaging. You need more than that.
Because we don't have any more questions on the chat right now, let me just ask you one more thing. What is the age range of the students you have been working with?
So we have been working from, let's say, the age of, the last years of primary, 5th and 6th year of primary. So
which means
10 to 12, more or less, and secondary. Secondary can be any year. We have to see a bit more if we can work with younger students. With secondary school, it can be any year, because we're talking about reflecting about languages, about comparing, and we have been working also in the 5th and 6th of primary, which is 10 to 12, from 10 onwards, let's say. But we have some teachers interested in working with younger students also, so we'll see a bit in the future.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see the results of your projects. Jasone, we don't have any more questions on the chat as far as I can see. I would really like to thank you for this fascinating lecture, for your slides, for your sharing the experience with us, and thank you very much for your answers to the questions. It's been a pleasure having you here at the University of Warsaw and in this international community that has been listening to your fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
It has been a real pleasure for me as well. Okay. Bye.
Bye.